for IPTV applications. You know, what are the IPTV needs for metadata today, and what AT&T is doing?
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I'm representing AT&T in the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, which is pretty much a North American focused standards effort, and also in the telco industry. However, the standards aren't really limited to the United States or North America, and there's a lot of participation from vendors, television manufacturers as well, for example, in different locations. And the hope is to create a set of standards, in particular, and for IPTV, that promote interoperability. And one of the tasks is, how do you define IPTV? And what they've done is kind of represented the definition loosely here, where it's delivery of IPTV over a managed network. One could also imagine internet television or some other term to refer to the increasing amount of live television that's available on the web over best effort networks. But that's explicitly excluded from this particular standards effort, although they are considering internet sourced content recently, which is perhaps user-generated content or content that contributors publish to the internet and then may be delivered to the end user over a managed network. And the effort is divided into a couple of phases. The first phase was more traditional, I would almost call it parity with existing cable delivery systems, where we want to deliver a linear service in a secure way with guaranteed quality of service. And the metadata comes into it in terms of content descriptions for program guides to allow users to navigate to content that they're interested in. The phase two is getting into content on demand and more advanced features that you would expect going forward, that everyone is referring to, like advanced targeted advertising, some other service and applications that are enabled by the IPTV infrastructure. The IP nature of everything is connected in the home can enable a wide suite of new services. And just the way ATIS is organized, excuse me, there's an architecture committee, there's a metadata committee, which I'm on, and I'll talk more in detail about that. And then there are other committees that are focused on security and quality of service. Testing interoperability is really starting, and I think there's room there to collaborate with other groups that do testing interoperability. The idea is it takes a lot of effort to do these kinds of things, and I think we want to minimize that the investment in that while maximizing the benefits of doing the interoperability testing. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's different work areas in the metadata group. Basically, they define any metadata for different aspects to support the IPTV service. A lot of that is content description, which I think is most relevant to what we're talking about today. But there's different levels of that, of course. There's high-level content description, which describes what the program title, genre, description, down to what we'd eventually like to see would be much more segment descriptions, parts of programs, and then as we get down toward things that are, I would call, more futuristic, of defining shot boundaries and speech to text and other time-varying metadata. Those really aren't the focus right now of ATIS, but what I can describe a little bit about how the work that's being done here meshes with MPEG 7 and MPEG 21 efforts that are already underway.
Yeah, Dave, just one question. Regarding the work areas, I see there is, on one side, really the effort in getting on par with the traditional television, right? So the transition to IP for this kind of service. And then I see an area in which there are new services, new functionality that are enabled. Maybe can you elaborate a bit on how metadata contributes, I would say, to this latter category? So how it enables new services, and what are the hot areas, I would say?
Right. You sense the practical versus the more futuristic, and so in some sense, the IPTV systems must comply with FCC regulations, for example, for emergency alerting, so that, and for content ratings to allow parents to filter content more easily for their kids, for example. So those are, we have metadata describing media that might have the rating information, and these are more traditional services that are sort of necessary to launch a service. But I think people are most excited about the new features that are available, and that also is practical because the service providers are trying to win more customers and differentiate this service from existing television services. So the effort is to quickly get to these more interesting services, either for users or the content owners, or the advertisers, for example. So you would like to develop new services that would allow customized advertising, and a user might not be too excited about more advertising coming toward them, but the hope is that with standards like this, one could target ads that are of interest to the user, so we can have metadata that describes personal interests and really get more targeted ads. I'm kind of more interested in areas like bookmarking content and three-screen services, so the idea of transferring your session from traditional television viewing scenario to a mobile scenario, seamlessly, having the same environments come up, or at least consistent environments across those, so that the users can really consume content wherever it's more convenient for them.
Right, and I like to go on with the slides, but then I want to hear what is the content provider perspective. So, so I want to hear Alberto, maybe commenting on these new services, in particular from the IPTV side. What is the view from a content provider perspective? So, Dave, I leave you the floor again.
Thank you. So at the end here, I've listed several specifications that are coming out of the Metadata Committee. There's a bunch of other specifications coming out of architecture areas and the other groups, but I've just listed these here as a status. And this is a work in progress, as you probably gathered. So some of the basic components are out, but there's a lot of work that's ongoing in these new services that Andrea was referring to. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the way these specifications work are following the model of TV Anytime and MPEG-7, where it's really an XML schema that is created, and that sort of defines the data model for how we represent the metadata and the syntax of that. And there's a descriptive text as well that kind of indicates how the schema is used. Because even with a schema, you can have some interoperability issues. The schema doesn't get you all the way toward full interoperability. So I think that's where a lot of interesting testing has to be done, and further work needs to be done. But the schema is a great start to get you moving in terms of the data types and the basic interoperability. Right. There's one particular area, for example, is this sort of consumer domain. There's a formalism where different domains are defined, like consumer domain, which is more like the household that's receiving the television content, and then the service provider domain, which is to do with metadata that as content flows through the IPTV service provider, which is also differentiated from a network provider, even though in most cases those two are the same. And then there's the content provider domain. And so we have to look at the different areas and make sure that the metadata is consistent across all these domains. For example, in the content provider domain, you may have ADI, VOD kind of metadata, whereas in the consumer domain, we're talking more about usage history, preferences expressed for content, accessibility preferences, and other content like usage for scheduled recordings and things like that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and this is kind of detailed, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of how these new specifications are harmonious with the prior specifications that are going on. And the idea is not to invent new standards that are just slightly different from existing standards or totally different from existing standards, but to extend and be kind of compatible with these specifications. Things in the United States.
Software. We know that today is really a time of tremendous change for the media industry. There is a need to focus on open standard-based platform and streamline workflows and automation and leverage business intelligence. We all know there is content that is literally exploding in terms of